ahead. Sorry about that. Well, good morning, everybody. And I don't have controls here, Davey. That's the only thing I didn't do. Nothing. All right, looks like we got it now. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sunday School. Nice to see everybody today. Nice for it to be dry for a change, but we needed the rain, and I'm certainly glad that we got it. So I hope you all fared as well as we did. And Gladys, as usual, we'll start off with a few prayer concerns. What do we have that we'd like to let everybody else know about and pray for this week?
My brother Garrett will have surgery on his ankle on Tuesday.
Surgery on his ankle on Tuesday.
Yeah, he was supposed to have it done last Wednesday, but he had blisters and they wouldn't do it.
Is that local here in Lynchburg?
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right, let's try to remember Garrett on Tuesday. You don't think surgery on an ankle sounds too bad, but you know what? Surgery is significant. That's why it starts with an S, I guess.
He was helping Jake with cows, and he was outside the fence, and the old cow knocked into the fence, and when she knocked into it, she lifted it up some kind of way, and it came down on his ankle. And he broke 3 bones.
Boy.
3 major ones.
Well, I think I know one cow that would be on his way for a freezer full of burger after that event, but that's why I'm not a cow farmer. All right, well, we will remember Garrett on Tuesday and pray that that surgery goes well and he's back up wrangling cattle again. What else? Recovering at home. Everything so far so good. All right. Still keep her in prayer. What else? That went out on the multiple health issues. I saw something on the prayer chain about that. Let's remember Tommy. And as always, we're thankful for those that were traveling and had a safe trip. That included a number of my family that was all over the place, including my youngest daughter and son-in-law that were up in Alaska. I got a nice new belt back from Alaska, so if you see a shiny new belt, that's where it came from. Although if Bev's watching, she's going to be mad that I pointed that out because she said this was not a Sunday belt. It's a new belt. What in the world? And then also, Doreen is back from her trip. That went well, so we're thankful for all of those blessings of safe travel. Remember our pastor as well. Continue to pray for him, peace, and to have success, and for all of those difficult challenges out there. And a safe return for him before long. Anything else? All right. Pray for our nation, and today's Sunday school lesson is going to touch a little bit, and I'll try not to get too preachy and stuff about things that are going on and what's we're pointing to or direction we're heading in this country now, but today's Sunday school lesson will sort of touch on that, being steadfast in difficulty. So I think we're going to get through all of it today. Feel free to chime in. We probably got extra time. Fear of heights. that guy's up there mountain climbing or something. He's got gear on and a hard hat, but climbing helmet, but looks like he's scared to death up there, doesn't it? I don't know. He's up in the air pretty good, but he's staying back, holding on to that rock right smart, just like me. Actually, it's not like me. I would have more sense than to be there in the first place, but at least he's got the gear on. And we're talking about fears to get us started. What are some fears that you've had to overcome in life? Or if it's not some fears that you were able to overcome, what are some fears that you've had? Nobody's scared of anything in our class. That's good to hear. Elevators, riding on elevators. So is it the fear the elevator's going to fall, or is it the...
I've had too many bad dreams, I guess, about being on one and, the bottom just drops out. You can feel yourself falling. I'm like, no.
Yep, I remember as a kid, I used to say the same thing, that if this thing falls, you're going to hit the ground really, really, really hard. And somebody told me and said, well, the thing to do is right before it hits the bottom, jump up. And that cancels the fall. And I thought as a kid, well, it's worth a try. And then I got to thinking, how do you know when you're getting ready to hit the bottom to jump? But, kids think about anything they can to come up with to ease their fears and such. Fear of falling in an elevator. Anything else? Well, that's good if you don't have too many other fears. What is ophidiophobia? Nobody's scared of snakes. That's, huh? Long as you see them first. That's kind of the way I am. We had a black snake living in our little workshop, and he'd been in there for a couple of years because I had never seen him, but I saw the sheds, where they shed their skin, find them regularly. And it's the only time that we didn't have any mice for 2 years in the workshop out there because he was keeping them cleaned up. And I went in there just a couple of weeks ago and went to plug in the fan, and when I reached over, right touching my tip of my thumb was his head. And I think when he stuck his tongue out, he actually touched the tip of my thumb. And I jerked my hand back real quick because I don't care. If you don't see it, it's going to scare you. And it was just a black snake. But I got a nice picture of him right there. And I called and made the mistake of telling Bev. And that was the end of it. She said, get rid of him. I said, he's catching the mice. He doesn't bother you. Well, she's got a little section of the shed that she uses for some storage and stuff. And she said, I'm never going in there again, and you'll have to get all the Christmas ornaments out of there. And I don't do Christmas ornaments, so I had to get rid of the snake. I caught him and carried him down the road and put him in the field. Black snakes keep away copperheads. Did you know that? So they're good snakes to have. All right, arachnophobia. Everybody knows that one? Mesophobia. That sounds like that commercial on television, doesn't it? That's the fear of germs, sort of like germophobia, but a different name for it. Trypanophobia. The fear of needles and getting shots and injections. Yeah. Here was a couple others they mentioned. Fear of thunder and lightning. I know people are kind of scared of lightning, but apparently real fears. And of course, fears of flying, that some people, their heart starts racing just at the thought of getting on an airplane or seeing an airplane up close. A fear of dogs, of course, that exists. And then some other fears that they came up with. Fear of making decisions. And then for the younger folks around, the fear of asking a girl on a date. I don't know if I can even remember that fear, but roller coasters? You fear roller coasters? I guess you're scared of them. I don't consider that a crippling fear. You just don't get on them. But anyway, those are some fears. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how some of our fears relate to our Christian walk, and see if we can find some comfort in God's Word and some direction in how to not be completely paralyzed by fear. One of the commentaries that I was reading was giving us a little bit of a background in the book of Revelation, and I think a lot of people are like me in that the book of Revelation is just very, very difficult for me to understand and process, so much so that I probably tend to avoid a lot of it. I don't like the controversy, and it just seems like there's a lot of stuff that's way over my head. Fortunately, in this series that we're in, we're not going to really get too much into the weeds. It says chapters 1 through 3 are basically the introduction in the messages to the 7 churches, and that's where we're going to be. So all of that simply to say, if you get a little bit confused or paralyzed in Revelations, understand that you're not alone. And of course, Matthew 24 is, they recommended reading that at the same time to be able to compare and contrast and understand basically what's going on if you do want to study that. I'm trying a little bit more than I have in the past to get there where I can grasp hold of that, but I'm nowhere near there yet. So I'm happy just staying in chapters 1 through 3, and we'll deal with the easy stuff, right? So again, a little more background. Letters to the 7 churches, what we're going to look at in all 6 of these lessons, all are laid out in a very similar way. Starts off with an address to a particular congregation, those 7 churches that we'll look at a map a little closer on. An introduction of who Jesus is, statement regarding the condition of the church. Every single one of these churches will be known for something that they are either good at or bad at or both. So there's a summary of their condition from Jesus' perspective, and that would include the verdict regarding their condition. And then there would be a command of some type. There's something that Jesus wants each one of those churches to do, and included in that, it's a word to all of us and a promise associated with it. And in yellow there is the key. You have to be cautious, somewhat cautious in looking at Revelation and trying to interpret all of that and then bring it into today's condition. But in chapters 1 through 3, it is very easy for us to look at what Jesus is saying to the 7 churches and also apply that to our Christian walk today. It's much easier to coordinate those two and sync them than it is with some of the other verses. So it's good that we're going to be in this section with the 7 churches. So again, here's a little different map from what we looked at, but just to orient us again on where we are. These are the modern day names for the countries around the Mediterranean, so you can see where these 7 churches are that we've talked about that we're going to be talking about. And last week, of course, we were talking about Ephesus, and today we'll be dealing with the letter to the church in Smyrna, which is just a little bit north of Ephesus, there on the coast of modern-day Turkey. Here is a zoom in of it. All of these churches very close there together, and we're going to be talking about Smyrna. Last week we talked about Ephesus, and what was it known as? It was the church that had lost its love. It had gone, Jesus' command was to return to your first love. So Ephesus we will call the loveless church, the church that had lost its first love, was doing lots of good deeds, but had lost their love. And today we're going to talk about Smyrna, and Smyrna will be known as the persecuted church. One of only 2 churches where Jesus does not issue, I don't want to use the word condemnation, but doesn't rebuke the church for doing something bad. They're doing very, very good. But they are a church that struggles with severe persecution and poverty, as we'll see. So we'll start right off with our first section, Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Write to the angel of the church in Smyrna, thus says the first and the last, the one who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and poverty, but you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. I know your affliction and poverty, but you are rich. We are rich in spiritual blessings when we live for Christ. That's no small statement. When we look at this, it's easy to gloss over that part. We're going to come back to that last, but let's look at the first part of this verse. Just like we did with the church in Ephesus, what do we know about the church in Smyrna? Smyrna was another, have you ever noticed when you write a word enough, it can be a simple word, like, you can write supper time. And if you write it enough, the more you look at it, you question yourself, am I spelling that right? It doesn't look right. Well, saying Smyrna, I was doing it through this Bible study, and I kept thinking, Smyrna, and I was trying to spell it, getting terribly confused. So you're going to hear it when I try to say Smyrna, you're going to hear all kinds of pronunciations today. Just ignore it. You know what I'm trying to say. And if you see a misspelling of it up there, don't be surprised by that either. I got terribly confused with that word. But it was a large church in a beautiful and proud city, center of learning and culture, and was very proud of its standing. They said that there was a tremendous focus on the sciences and medicine in Smyrna. So they were very proud of themselves, much like we talked about Athens a couple of weeks ago. The people were very proud of themselves, and one of the people described it as this, said this about it. Smyrna was an outstandingly beautiful city that claimed for itself the title, the glory of Asia. They had that as a name for themselves, and if you think about it, yep, there's a certain amount of pride there. Imagine if said sign out there, welcome to Pamplin City, the glory of Virginia. They were proud of themselves in a major way. And if you think about it, it shouldn't really surprise you when you look at the rest of the condition of the city, because what always comes with pride? A focus on ourselves, right? And these people would certainly fall into that category. But they said it was a beautifully landscaped city. The Mediterranean that's nice climate over there for growing stuff. And this city took advantage of it. Very nicely landscaped and ornate. A beautiful city. So that's actually kind of interesting and nice to know. Again, like many of the port cities of the time, it would have been very, very wealthy, and it would have been heavily populated and visited. A lot of people came and went through the ports. This particular city, hard to see in that map, but you have all of these rivers that flow into I think it's the Aegean Sea right there beside them. And all of these rivers were major transport routes. Smyrna had one of the best harbors right there in the area. And so they had lots of wealth and riches and all sorts of things associated with culture and that environment of having many people who came through your gates. They said that it had especially rich trade in wines. And wines not quite in the day then like we would look at them now as purely just an alcoholic drink. Wine and things like that were much easier to keep, and that's the way you stored your drink in the day. But that's where Smyrna is in Asia. What else do we know about Smyrna? Well, when you look back at it, Smyrna was much like many of the other cities that we've looked at. They had a problem with idolatry, the same as many, many others. And every time I look at this and I think, wow, what is the common denominator here? Why is the idolatry popping up over and over again in all of these cities? And this is just me, not the Sunday school lesson, but me. I said, well, it kind of goes back to man has a need to worship something. God gave us that, right? And if you're not going to worship the one true God, then hey, bring a tree out here, a flower pot, a pig, whatever it is, we'll worship that. Find me something to worship. Man has a desire to do it. And I thought, well, how about the people that say, oh, there's nothing, I don't worship anything. And I said, well, you know what? That ain't true either. Everybody worships something. They may worship under the radar in a way that you don't see, not in a formal setting or whatever, but everybody worships something. And I got to looking around this past week in the news and such, and I saw some of the information coming out about all of the COVID, where did it come from, where was its origins, and who had sent this email, and this, that, and the other. And I said, yeah, you know what? There are a lot of people that say they don't worship anything, but you know what they worship? They worship science. They think that they can figure out the answer to everything, and they worship science. So everybody worships something. This city was no different. They were into idolatry, idol worship, had all kinds of different gods and goddesses up there, temples that they had built. But slowly over time, their big emphasis came to worshiping the Roman emperor. That was where it all ended up kind of shaking out afterwards. And the most important thing was to worship the Roman emperor. Everybody. Smyrna was an ally of Rome even before Asia was annexed into the empire. So before it was formally a part of the Roman Empire, it was an ally of Rome. Because of that historic relationship, it enjoyed the imperial status as a free city, meaning that it had a degree of self-government. In John's day, Smyrna was also renowned as a center for Roman emperor worship. The city also possessed temples dedicated to many pagan gods. So there you are, a lot of the common denominator in many of these big cities and centers of culture. Well, as the Roman emperor worship went on, it got to be very, very significant and pointed. You could not simply passively worship the emperor. The emperor actually wanted everyone to say, Caesar is Lord. And he wanted it with a big L, not just a little l. Caesar is Lord. They said that all that the Christians had to do was to burn a pinch of incense and say, Caesar is Lord, and they would receive a certificate, and then they could go and live their own life. So all they had to do was compromise, burn a little piece of incense, and say that to some authority, and then he would give them their certificate, and they could go about and say, okay, they have met the requirement to worship Caesar. You can go about your life. You can conduct business. You can do everything that everyone else can do. But they wouldn't do it, would they? The real believers simply refused to do that. There was only one Lord, and their Lord was going to be Jesus Christ, no matter what the emperor would say. Well, this added into a lot of problems for many of the people that were there. There was a large Jewish population that was also hostile to the Christians in the city. So you've got a Jewish population, you have a Gentile population, and you have this heavily pagan worship going on throughout the whole city. Even the Jewish population didn't like the Christians. The Jews desired to separate themselves from early Christians, and they persecuted those Christians to demonstrate to the remainder of the society that Christianity was a separate group rather than a sect of Judaism. So there was a tendency to look at the Jews and then the Christians off as just a subset of the Jews. And the Jews were basically saying, nope, we have nothing to do with them. They're apart and separate. And they're the ones that are refusing to worship Caesar as Lord. These Jews were exempt from worshiping the emperor. But because they ostracized Christians from Judaism, Christians were not exempt from emperor worship. This created tension with the Gentile population because the Gentiles required everyone but Jews to worship the emperor, a stance that the early Christians could not accept. Apparently, this did not ease with time, since Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, the pastor of Smyrna, was martyred in AD 155 for refusing to declare that Caesar was Lord. This background of persecution would frame the letter Jesus sent to Smyrna. So the head of the church refused to bow down and worship Caesar, and he was killed because of it. How did Christ identify himself to this assembly of believers? He called himself the first and the last. What is the significance of the first and the last? If you say you're the first and the last, that is, according to Isaiah, that is a title reserved only for that one that would identify himself as Christ. You see back there in Isaiah 41, he said, I am the first and the last. Isaiah in chapter 44, and there were a couple other verses, and also in Revelation. The first and the last, titles that only belong to the Lord. You know, at first and the last, in Greek, they would have used the Greek alphabet, the Alpha and Omega. You've heard about that. You've read that. You've heard that in song before. The first and the last letters of the Greek alphabet. They pointed out an interesting, everybody likes trivia. I know I do. They pointed out an interesting fact here. The designation of Christ as the Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, appears in two other places in the book of Revelation. It appears in chapter 1, verse 17, and again in Revelation 22, verse 13. What's significant about that? The terminology is at the beginning and the end of Revelation. Coincidence? Yeah, maybe, I don't know. I don't think so. I think everything in the Bible is there for a reason. And even in describing himself that way, the Holy Spirit inspired John. Again, it's coming from Klaus, so it isn't worth anything. Everything the Holy Spirit gave John to write was there for a reason. So even in the book, he refers to himself at the first of Revelation and at the last of Revelation. Not earth-shattering, but certainly interesting. Well, then he goes on and refers to himself to one who was dead and came to life. So clearly we're talking about Jesus' death and resurrection here. And there was only one who was resurrected. He is essentially reminding all of them that he has unmatchable authority and ability, the only one. And then you see there that they talk about Smyrna as actually a name for myrrh. And we know myrrh was one of the gifts upon Jesus' birth, and we also know upon Jesus' death, he was anointed with myrrh, right? So again, the beginning and the end, the symbolism is pretty dramatic here when you look at it. Jesus is indeed God, and he is the first and the last. In addition to the first and the last, Jesus also identified himself as the one who was dead and came to life. This past tense usage of these verbs indicated that this event was anchored in the past. It is a clear reference to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The city of Smyrna had experienced a death and resurrection itself, as it was destroyed around 600 BC and rebuilt in the 3rd century. It thrived, and it was reestablished as a Greek city and strengthened its position as it aligned with Rome. So you see the symbolism again there. The city was destroyed and rebuilt, just like Jesus, who was dead and came back to life. Again, more symbolism in comparison. But it's got to be significant because it appears so many times in this letter. But Jesus' death and resurrection was not political. It was physical and it was spiritual. Jesus must have uniquely chosen these words for Smyrna because the letter would reveal that they were facing tremendous persecution and the threat of death. The powerful people in Smyrna may have been able to take the present lives of the Christians, but Jesus assured them that even then they would live again. So Jesus points to his own death and resurrection and says, do not fear, I can take care of any of it. All right, what's significant about this? That he said he was the first and the last and the one who came to life again. They gave us a few things to look at and consider about what was so significant of him referring to himself, introducing himself in this way. Well, number one is to point out that there is no time concept with God. There was no time when God didn't exist in the past, and there's no time that God won't exist in the future. So time to God is irrelevant. It's only relevant to us. His expression is unqualified identification with the God of the Hebrews. That doesn't mean he was unqualified. I didn't like the way they worded it, but I left it. He was expressing his unqualified identification with the God of the Hebrews. There was no prerequisites or no, well, I'm God, buts. It's unqualified. It's total and complete. Not a good way to say it, but that's what they were pointing out. He is the one true God who created the universe and is sovereign over it and controls it. He sees and knows the span of times, again, specifically related to us. His salvation was effective and is effective forever and ever. And then the last one, I started to put that in red because I think that was the most important one. He knows and will guide events of history, even though humans like to think we are controlling local and world events. And I thought about that as I was looking at all the stuff in the news this week. And I said, yeah, you know what? You look at all those people on the news being interviewed, stick a microphone in their face, and they get on camera, and they're going to, well, I think that this could, and they all are blathering and blathering and blathering, and they think they're the most important people in the world and that they are really doing something to change the course of history. And I thought, in comparison with reading this week in Revelation, I said, you know, somebody really should send them a copy of our Sunday school book and say, well, read this. You're not really controlling anything. You are at best a simple little pawn. But my goodness, don't us prideful humans like to think we're doing a lot. All right, well, in the next verse, he goes in to talk about, I know your affliction and poverty. We've read about other places where affliction in the Christian life comes about, and we kind of know that this is tribulation is a better word for it than affliction. The persecution, possibility of death, and specifically related to living for Christ. The reason they were suffering these afflictions and tribulations came was because they were living for Christ, and they refused to worship the emperor as Lord. A lot of the affliction could have been removed by simply doing that, in other words. So by taking a stand, they were welcoming this level of affliction and tribulation into their life, or inviting it rather, because they took a stand. And then when they mention poverty, that is a very simple word. I know your affliction and poverty. That sounds very minimal. But again, when you go back and look at the word poverty, and like I always say, the English language absolutely stinks, because all we hear is poverty and think, okay, well, they were poor. But it's not just that they were poor. They said a better word, or a better description, was abject poverty, materially destitute. So they were, they were routinely robbed. They would confiscate, the government could confiscate their property. Whatever they had accumulated could just be taken from them. And even though they didn't view it as such, it was nothing but legal robbery. Legal robbery. And I could make a joke and say that's almost similar to what goes on today. But anyway, I won't do that. Fired from jobs for retaliation or whatever, as a result of them following Christ. Those people would lose jobs and employment. Not the same way we have it today, but business dealings and such canceled just because somebody would find out, you following Christ? You're not getting grain from me. Starve to death, I don't care. But the way they phrased it, I thought, well, you know what, leave that in there. Fired from jobs because of the decisions they made and who they were going to follow. Does that sound familiar today? I started to put a couple of news headlines up here, and I didn't do it, but I think y'all probably have already seen a lot of the stuff I've seen. It's getting to be a scary time, isn't it? A very scary time. And even though we're not yet faced with death, there are people getting beaten in the streets of America because of what they look like, what kind of clothes they're wearing. They're wearing what's the Jewish hat? Yarmulke. They're getting beaten in the streets in broad daylight. This is happening in our country today. So I looked at that and I said, fired from jobs back then, and here we are today. How absolutely nothing has changed. The omniscient Lord said that he knew the traumatic crisis in the church that church in Smyrna was facing. First, he knew their affliction, sometimes translated tribulation, referring to the burdensome and painful attacks that the believers of Smyrna endured for their faith in Jesus. The Romans made these believers' lives difficult because the Christians would not participate in the emperor cult that dominated the city culture. Second, the Lord knew their poverty. Because of their faith, Christians of Smyrna were experiencing prejudice and economic boycotts by the pagan citizens of the city. The economic strain took its toll on them. They lived in one of the richest cities in the world, yet they were seriously lacking in the basic necessities of life. So, the church in Smyrna we will know as the persecuted church. What is slander? Slander, the utterance of false charges. This is straight out of the dictionary, or misrepresentations which defame and damages another's reputation. I'll sue you for slander. Specifically back then, this was related to lies that were done to discredit the church's witness. So people would go out of their way to slander the Christians, the followers of Christ, to damage the testimony and witness of these real Christians to everyone else who was watching. Historically, people who say they're Jews and are not. Historically, we were told that there was a large and hostile community of Jews in Smyrna, but this tells us that a true Jew is one who trusts God and believes in Jesus Christ. Others may be Jews ethnically, which still has a place before God, but they are not Jews spiritually before God. And then remember, the box is important here. In all of this, they pointed out, I know. Jesus says, I know. I know your poverty. I know what you're struggling with. We saw it last week with the letter to the church of Ephesus. I know. In the midst of all of this affliction, it's easy to think that God has forgotten. It's easy to fall into that pity party. It's easy for us today, but try to imagine exactly what they were dealing with compared to today. Everything, they say something bad in the press or whatever, people go out and protest and spit on someone who is praying in public at a game or something like that. Chump change, right? That's small beans. These people are actually being beaten to death with their affliction. And even though today we can get into the pity party of thinking, man, we're really being persecuted, these people knew what persecution was. But even in their persecution, God is telling them, and He's telling us, I know. He has not forgotten. $18, $19, where did my number go? Give me 10 minutes, I'll figure it out. Okay. So, he's talked about their affliction and their poverty, persecution from those who said they were Jews, but they were not really Jewish followers. They were walking or talking the talk, but not walking the walk. And we've seen that many, many times in different places. The Lord told the believers of Smyrna that He was aware of slander or blasphemy that they had received from those in town claiming to be Jewish. Jesus said that the believers' persecutors were not authentic Jews at all, but frauds, simple frauds. They may have had the right ethnic pedigree, but being a true Jew was more than a matter of outward membership in a race or practicing legalistic religiosity. God judges a person by one's faith in Christ or lack thereof, not one's heritage, nationality, race, or gender. So the takeaway from that was be very aware. Here's an exact example. These people thought they were Jews. God Himself says they're not. They're not even Jews. They are a synagogue of Satan. They're following the evil one. The takeaway from that is today, when you hear people who, make jokes, I have to watch what I say because some of them might be listening right now. I've heard people say before, yeah, I grew up in the church. And you want to go, so? I grew up in the church. That makes me a Christian, right? Mom and Dad have been members over at Elon Baptist Church for 120 years. I grew up in the church. I'm a Christian. Well, not really. It takes more than that, right? And the same thing was going on with these people. They were living a Jewish life, but God says they weren't even Jews. But Jesus points all of that out, and then He says, but you are rich. Even though all of this stuff is happening, you're in abject poverty, you're being beaten and persecuted. These people who say they're Jews hate you, but they're not even Jews. They're followers of Satan. But you are rich. All right, here's the other box. I like the way they said this. Regardless of their earthly circumstances or financial status, they are rich in Christ Jesus. And I almost changed the word so it would apply to us today to say, regardless of our earthly circumstances or our financial status, we are rich in Jesus Christ. That's the way it should read. This is what Jesus thought of them. And if Jesus considered them rich, then they were rich. That's the bottom line. If Jesus says you're doing well, you're doing well. And it doesn't matter what anybody else says or what the standard of the world is. Our estimation of ourselves is far less important than God's estimation of us. Something we always need to think about, and I have to remind myself all the time, because I can fall into this trap in a second, comparing myself to everyone else in the world, and then I go, wait a minute. Do I need to please man? Do I need to please God? Big reality check for me constantly when I look at that. In what ways are we rich in God's grace? Well, we're certainly rich in faith, our life in Christ, God's presence in our life, and His power at work in our lives. And the fruit of the Spirit, we've talked about the fruit of the Spirit before. But the biggie there for me was God's promises. And I said, well, wonder which promises they're talking about of God's promises that we're rich in. And I thought, well, you know what? If you want to try to put a dollar value on something, I was showing pictures of my Labrador there at the beginning. Bev and I love that dog to death. We've talked about it before. If we were to get a divorce, there would be no fights over the cars, the house, whatever you want. But that dog right there, we'd be in court battling each other to the death. Spend every dime we got. I'm taking it. No, I'm taking it. No, I'm taking it. That dog is valuable. Can I put a price on that dog? If you said, Klaus, I want to buy Daisy. Tell me how much she's worth. Can't put a price on her. You're out of your mind. You're not buying it anyway. Think about this. How much is salvation worth? If you could put a price on it, you can't. You know, our tractors and stuff, if we want to take up a loan, we can put a tractor up and say, okay, here, how much is this tractor worth? I'm going to put it up as collateral on the loan. It has a value. Your house has a value. Everything has a value. How much is salvation worth? You're going to put a dollar value on it. The finest diamonds in the world, or rubies or gems or whatever they make, they have a price. They're all insured at a price. They have a value. How much is your salvation worth? Well, we're going to look at that the same way I look at Daisy times a million, right? There is no such thing as putting a price on our salvation. We're indeed rich beyond, when you look at that one thing alone, beyond anything that could be imagined. All right, real quick. Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Look, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison to test you, and you will experience affliction for 10 days. Be faithful to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. What you're about to suffer. If we're followers of Christ, we know it's coming, don't we? And I think in my short 56 years, I'm beginning to understand it more. Perhaps some of you that are older already knew this. But the Bible predicts it. If they hate me, they're going to hate you. The adversity is going to come, and it's going to come simply because we're followers of Christ. And what are we going to do when the time comes when they say, all right, say, burn your incense and say Caesar is Lord. Or in this country, burn your incense and say, name your most hated politician as Lord. Are you going to do it? Are you going to do it to be able to do business, to be able to go into Kroger and fill your grocery cart up with food? Are you going to let your children and grandchildren be hungry because you're not going to do it? These people decided we're not going to do it. And they suffered all of the consequences because of it. And the Sunday school lesson was pretty brutal, I thought, in the way they had worded some of these things. We're not going to go into all of the details. And I was surprised they went this far, but they said, you know what? We need to think about it right now today. As Christians, are we going to be willing to suffer to the point of death for the gospel? And, you know, we've asked that question before in a sense. You've heard people speak, missionaries around the world talking about believers in some of these countries that they go to that do experience that level of persecution. And it's always been off in the distance. It's always been over there. But I don't think I'm stretching too far when I say if you look at the trajectory of America today, we are headed in that direction. If I say things like that, people will look at me like I have three eyes. Are you kidding? This is America. We don't kill people because they worship somebody in America. You can worship a truck. You can worship a duck. You can worship anything you want. Nobody cares. That's true. That's 100% true until you tell them you worship Jesus Christ. And then it all changes. And why? Because that's the one true God. Anyway, here was their message in all of that, thinking about it in advance. We need to prepare ourselves now. You can't get ready for a battle when the battle is already underway. It's too late to start cleaning your gun and stacking up ammunition once they're shooting at you. You need to prepare for the battle in advance. You need to prepare for the storm when the storm, you can't prepare when it's raging. You must already be prepared. So if we know that hurricane category 5 is hitting the coast and it's going to come right across Virginia and into Pamplin, next Wednesday, what are we going to do today? We got to prepare. It's too late when the storm hits on Wednesday. You know, those are great analogies when you think about it. And what they're warning us about today is we need to think about what's going to happen. Jesus wanted the church to take notice that their enemy was not the Jews and the Gentiles in Smyrna, but someone far more sinister who had a plan that was about to unfold. The devil's going to throw you into jail. Did he mean the devil himself was going to walk around grabbing people? No. But he was going to use others to do his deeds. Back then, operated the same way he operates now. Using others to do his dirty work. And that happens today just the same way. If we endure, we get the crown of life. They went into much information about crowns in that day. You think about the early days of the Olympics, you know, they didn't get a gold medal when they won the race. They got a crown. It was important. The symbolism of a crown was significant in that day to people, and Jesus referred to it as the crown of life, more so than just the crown of gold and other symbols. All right, we're going to close with that. We almost got all the way through it. It wasn't too terrible bad. I hope y'all enjoyed that as much as I did. This series at first, I kind of raised an eyebrow when I looked at it, but I kind of enjoyed it because I finally get to something in Revelation that I feel like I can sort of grasp and figure out and understand and maybe even apply it today. Final thoughts, comments, questions? All right, well, we will go into our third church next week. I did not look ahead, so I can't even tell you which one it is, but you've got it in your Sunday school book. If anybody needs a Sunday school book, we've got another one down there. All right, let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we are thankful for